Hi, thank you for watching this video. I'm Godin-Dubois and I'm going to present you our work on spontaneous modular neuroevolution in an artificial life context as part of the Alive 2021 conference. So, the focus of our work is the emergence of fear, which originates from early predatory defense systems. And more specifically, the definition we're going to use in this work is that fear is caused by particular stimuli that in turn cause particular patterns of behavior that are intending to help cope with the situation and promote survival. However, emotions as a whole, especially in the case of the human brain, are a very complex subject, as illustrated in the work of Ledoux, where a large number of interacting components are responsible for the emergence of conscious fear. Each of these modules can in itself be a very complex subnetwork. It follows that when creating virtual agents, numerous directions have been explored. There are work for the classification of emotion. We have agents that are able to determine whether the individual is subjected to joy or fear and so on. Other work focus on quantifying such emotion, such as labeling a certain response with a fear level, and other try and emulate emotions in order to make more plausible virtual agents with which humans can relate, because they can more easily understand simulated emotional background. And in most cases, such agents rely on a modular architecture that's pre-coded by the experimental designer. And for instance, in this work, you can see that the outputs are directly fed to 3 specific modules, which correspond to brain regions, and the interaction of these artificial brain regions are expected to emulate the emotional responses observed in the human brain. However, we argue in this work that artificial neural networks are very important to not only emulate emotions, but to understand the underlying phenomenon. And so what we are going to advocate in this work is that starting from a homogeneous neural substrate, which means that we only be working with neurons. If modular structure arises, then it's going to be an emergent process. We are not going to force it to appear. And by indirectly encoding such a neural substrate, the topology and connectivity will be improved generations after generations. And from that, we ask 2 questions. First, does the use of a homogeneous neural substrate preclude the emergence of modular structures? And if modular structures do arise, how do they relate with biology? Are they reminiscent of similar structures in the biological brain, or are they something completely different? So naturally, the main component of our system are the creatures themselves, which are composed of a circular body. They can perceive their environment through 2 types of sensors. They have auditory inputs through a pair of ears on each side of the body, which responds to different frequencies, 1 for noise produced by walking, and 3 for the vocalization, which I'll come back later on. And they also have vision through a number of raycasting that provides red, green, and blue colors information. So based on that, they have similar types of inputs to that of the animal brains, frequency, and color-based retina. They are able to move through a pair of motors, and they can perform forward and backward motion as well as on-the-spot rotation, and they are able to vocalize through a forward-facing mouth. As the experiment is minimalist, the metabolism of these creatures is kept very simple. There's only 2 components in the metabolism. first the clock speed, which defines whether or not the individual wants to engage in a sprinting behavior or a more quiescent state. It is controlled by a pair of genetic parameters, C0 and C1, which define the lower and upper bound of this clock speed, and a neural output allows the creature to have fine control over the immediate value at every time step. This value is then used to directly control the energy expenditure of the creature, which also relies on the actual motor output of the creature. So in order to survive longer, a creature could stay immobile, but it will fail to reach any food source and then thus will die off. In the case of an immobile individual, we expect the current parameters allow for a life expectancy of about 60,000 time steps. Based on the fact that the main interest of our work is the emergence of modular structures in an artificial neural network, it comes as no surprise that we are going to rely on a neural substrate. This neural substrate is a two-dimensional Cartesian grid. The inputs are placed on the bottom row with the auditory inputs right above the visual inputs. Each column corresponds to a specific ray with the altitude corresponding to red, green, and blue respectively. For the audition, the lowest neuron corresponds to noise, that is, noise coming from motion, and the other three correspond to communication channels. The output is straightforward, as we can see the motors, clock speed, and vocalization outputs. And the methodology we used to go from such a collection of unconnected neurons to a fully functional artificial neural network is based on the ES hyperneat algorithm. Very briefly, starting from CPPN, a composite pattern processing network, which is basically an evolvable mathematical function, we can, by defining a function that takes the coordinate and outputs a single value, interpret this function as an image. And as we can see, it allows for the generation of repetitive pattern with variation and with regions of varying density. If, however, instead of one coordinate, we use two coordinates, then we move from generating images to generating connectivity patterns in a four-dimensional hypercube, with the first coordinate being that of the input node and the second coordinate being that of the output node. Furthermore, by searching for regions of high informational density, we can, thanks to the evolvable substrate addition to the hyperneat algorithm, define regions where hidden neurons should be instantiated, specifically those where the derivation is high, such as this one or the edges of the big blobs. The methodology is thus to, starting from an input neuron, search for locations of high informational density and generate hidden neurons at these locations, repeat the procedure from the newly discovered hidden neurons, and finally tie it all up by performing the same procedure backward from the output neurons. This ensures that we have a functional topology with hidden neurons connected both to the input and the output. Through this methodology, both the connectivity and the topology of the artificial neural network can be evolved through a single genomic component. So in this experiment, we placed the creatures in a minimalist survival scenario. The simplest one is on the leftmost side. We have a subject at the edge of the arena that has to reach a food source. More complex cases include the presence of a harmless clone of the subject, which can be seen as an ally, and a potentially harmful creature, the predator or the enemy, which will actively seek the subject and try and capture it. Finally, we also have a combination of the previous two, where both the ally and the enemy are present, and the task becomes one of discrimination because the ally is always on the food's side. In order to have reasonable evaluation time, the simulation is stopped if the individual has consumed more than 10% of its energy reserves without finding the food source. So we reward the individual if it has successfully reached the food source, and we reward the speed at which it has succeeded. If it has not reached the goal in the expected time frame, we provide an incentive so that next generations can go closer and closer to the goal. And finally, if it has been captured by a predator, then it suffers a large penalty, thereby producing the life paradox concept. It has to reach the food source, but it also has to avoid the enemy. In the experiment, we used for the CPP endpoint a per neuron bias and a level of expression output, which allows for a finer control over the topology. And the evolution parameters correspond to 1,000 generations for each run, with populations of 200 individuals and 4 elites being conserved across generations. We also used novelty search in order to escape the local minimum of sprinting straight for the food source. We performed 50 replicates of this experiment in order to have an overview of the behavioral landscape, and the resulting artificial neural networks were of reasonable complexity, as illustrated here with an average topology with respect to the maximal potential topology. It only has slightly less than 2/3 of the potential neurons, with reasonable retinas and a sparse connection pattern. However, defining the specific roles of each region is not a straightforward task, so what we did is that we subject this neural network to very simple conditions. For instance, we only expose it to a single enemy, and we tag each neuron with respect to whether or not it responded to the presence of this enemy. We repeat the procedure for different types of stimuli, and when aggregating each individual tag, we are able to generate a modular version of this neural network, which highlights the functional responsibilities of different parts of the creature's brain. The scenarios in which these creatures were evaluated are very simple, which are canonical situations. In the first two cases, either no stimuli is present, or it's the ally in the first case, or the predator. In the second case, we alternate between the presence of an ally and a predator to test the differences in regimes between these stimuli. So based on this experimental protocol, we expected some individuals to exhibit fearful demeanor and some to forego any such considerations, and indeed that is what we obtained. For instance, the individual presented here has a somewhat sparse neural network, and we can see from the modular version of its network that it has no neuron dedicated to the detection of the predator. The large module at the center is dedicated to the ally stimulus, and the other one did not respond to either the ally or the predator. We can see furthermore that it's a reasonable repartition of neurons, with 60% in the ally module against 40% in the other module. And indeed, when observing the dynamics of the modules in the hospitable case when faced with the ally against the hostile case when faced with the enemy, we can see that there is very little difference except for the final part of the evaluation where an increase is noted when in presence of the ally. Indeed, the trajectories are very similar in both cases, with only a very slight variation in the evasion of the enemy at the very end. Conversely, the models themselves behave in much the same manner as illustrated previously. Another instance of behavior is on the opposite side of the spectrum with a fearful individual. It has a much denser neural network with almost twice as many hidden neurons and a much denser connectivity pattern. What's more interesting, however, is that it has a predator module and that this predator module comprises 57% of the creature's hidden neurons. So this creature has the means to detect the predator, and indeed, when we have a look at the dynamics of this predator module, we can see that they have very different patterns when faced with the ally and when faced with the enemy. Indeed, the first thing we can see is that they have very different durations. In the hospitable case, the individual quickly reaches the goal, whereas in the hostile case, it fails to do so, reaching the upper limits of the evaluation. Furthermore, we can see that while in the hospitable case, the fear response of the individual is dynamical and moves throughout the evaluation, in the hostile case, it stays very high throughout the evaluation. Indeed, the trajectories and the behavior of the creature is very different in both cases. Whereas in the first one, it goes more or less straight for the food source, in the second case, it avoids contact with the enemy. And in terms of evolutionary game theory, it defects from the competition. It prefers not to play rather than risking failure. So with this in mind, we had an individual that showed a kind of fearful demeanor and an individual that showed no such fearful demeanor. So what we did is that we wanted to test whether or not the emergence of this predator module was a random event or whether or not it was indeed something that hinted at a modular emergence structuration. So we selectively disconnected specific inputs to the predatory module for those runs in which a predatory module was present. And we investigated more specifically two types of lesion. In the first case, we deactivate the red cells, that is, the predator module does not receive the red information. However, this information can still be conveyed throughout other routes in the creature's brain. And in the second case, we deactivate the noise input, which provides information on the presence of either the predator or the ally. The question we asked is, does this lead to a loss of fear-related behavior, or does this induce a general catastrophic loss of functionality? And as we can see, when comparing the standard case on the left with the visually impaired individual, we see that initially the trajectories are the same, but very quickly the individual reverses its direction and resumes its foraging behavior. It almost reaches the food source before being captured by the predator. In case of the auditive lesions, we see that initially both trajectories are almost identical, with both individuals racing for the wall and staying there. However, in the second case, after some time, the individual also resumes its foraging behavior. Instead, going by the rightmost portion and succeeding in reaching the goal. Once more, by comparing the activity level of the predator modulars, we can see that compared to the standard case, in the auditive lesions, the relaxation period occurring around the 15th second is somewhat similar to that observed at the very end of the evaluation in the standard case, and this hints at a relaxation occurring much more early, potentially thanks to the lack of a stressful auditory input. Similarly, when comparing the standard with the visual case, we can see a much more relaxed behavior reminiscent of the hospitable case, where the predator module does not peak at the 0.8 value, and instead remains dynamic throughout the evaluation. We tested whether or not this observation hold for the entirety of the population, and when comparing the activity level in both cases, we found out that in the natural case, that is in the scenarios corresponding to the evolution, only auditory inputs were found statistically significant. However, one must keep in mind that these natural conditions are very biased because, for instance, the individual can fail to make eye contact with the predator, as illustrated in our previous example. So we performed the same evaluation for the control case, which was much more positive in both the visual and auditory types of lesion. Furthermore, we attempted to classify the population into different groups, and we see that mostly the auditory lesions are those that have the most impact on the activity level of the creature. This might be so because of the omnipresent auditory input, whereas visual input requires almost direct contact with the source of the stimuli. So in this experiment, we devised a minimalist survival experiment in which individuals had both to forage for food and evade a potential predator. Through this experiment, we have seen the emergence of a fear-like behavior with evasion strategies or border strategies consisting of straightforward racing. This fear-like behavior was observed not only at the behavioral level, but also on the neuronal and the emerging modular level. We were able to perform a modularization of the artificial neural network through a biological analogy by identifying clusters of self-similar neurons in terms of functionality. And in future work, we plan to improve the system first by moving onto a three-dimensional substrate, which will help cope with the similar inputs. For instance, in case of the auditory inputs, they could be placed all on the z-axis, thereby providing an easier task for the ES-hyperNet algorithm to segregate between similar inputs. And we also want to add locality constraints because for now the modules are only based on similar functionality but are not based on a speciality, which is a biological constraint that these artificial neural networks are not subjected to. However, we expect that such a constraint will provide more easily understandable results as well as more robust demeanor by enforcing local constraints. Additionally, we plan on adding morphological components. For now, the individuals are only composed of a circular body, but the model is designed so that they can grow artifacts which should help cope with varying situations. And through these morphological components, we are planning on moving on to larger scale interaction instead of 1 or of 2 or 3 individuals, we plan on engaging these creatures into ranged battles with hundreds of individuals from different species battling one another thanks to their morphological components and through communication, which would help regulate the strategies. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.